Just posting follow-up comment on a recent Kotaku article about World of Warcraft that stated that 10% of players accounted for 50% of the time spent on playing. This is, if this wasn't the case, that would be what's ordinary. I mean, one of the things that people have to learn about thinking about the internet is that you may have been educated or trained to think in a world of averages and standard deviations. And this works good for, say, height. The average person is, say, about 5'10" with 4 inches. You very rarely meet someone 6'10". You very rarely meet somebody 3 foot or 4'10". Standard deviations work for certain things, but for other things in the world, like say income, it doesn't work. A very small number of people control a huge amount of the income, and the distribution disparities are really not average. I'm sure even in maybe in your local neighborhood, but I know in my local neighborhood, standard deviations and averages wouldn't be that helpful in understanding income. There's huge disparity between incomes, particularly between people who moved in their house at different times. The internet always has this. If you look at certain people, maybe 5% of Facebook users have almost all of the contacts, all of the links. A certain number of YouTube bloggers are going to have almost all the views. Certain web bloggers or bloggers dominate the view population, and while the rest of us kind of exist in this long tail of users, it gets smaller and smaller. This is essentially how the physics of the internet and most of reality actually works. So what you're always going to see every time you look at a user population is you're going to see this power law distribution where a small percentage of the people dominate the production of content, the linking of content to social networks. This is actually comes up very important in my day-to-day work because people will often try to estimate storage requirements for businesses. And they'll ask, well, what's the average number of transactions? What's the average size? What's the average number of links a person has? Trying to say, okay, this is the average and then multiply by the total user population, when in fact what's going to happen is the average number, the typical, the modal one, the picture you'd get if you took a random sample of, say, 50 people in an organization of 100,000 is not going to give you an idea of total storage requirements or total processor requirement, because a very small group of people at the tail are going to extremely dominate and they're going to require more. I mean, a way of metaphor of saying this is you have a bar of 100 people. Okay, what's the fastest way to make the average person in that bar a millionaire? The answer is to have Bill Gates walk in. So averages, I mean, it's extremely misleading. We live in a world, when we're in the internet, we're living in a world dominated by power laws. And we really need to start educating people to think about this, particularly to stop thinking in the model of means and averages and start really thinking, I'm building up, looking at this social network. 5% of these people are going to account for 40% of the connectivity, 40% of the content production, and that there's a long tail at work and in other things. I mean, particularly in open source. If you look at something like Wikipedia, a small group of people are the core of the content production. But then you've also got an extremely long tail. It's also important not to assume that 10% that is producing most of the, say, in-world content or spending most of the time in world or producing web content somehow all the value or targeting just this group. The long tail, the 90% of other users who spend the other half of the world, each one of them may account for very, very little, but they still account for half of the rest of the world, and that maybe some of those little bitty contributions will become extremely essential. Okay, and there's a very good book out by Skarkey called "Here Comes Everyone," and one of the things he's often saying is that one person, in the long tail, who contributes only maybe a few hours a year to a project like the Linux kernel, might actually create a critical vulnerability check that Microsoft would never actually pay a staff person to meet, because Microsoft just wants to have that 10% super productive. So Don't be surprised by this data, and also don't conclude then that you should just concentrate on those top 10% targets. There is value in the long tail. I think one of the things that Wikipedia has learned is those hundreds of thousands of very, very small time editors that really make the difference between a successful social collaboration, social community, and a failure.